What if the weapon a country spent 40 years hiding could still be found and broken open in a single night? That is exactly what appears to have happened outside Isfahan, and the story behind it is stranger than most people realize. Before we go any further, if this kind of story matters to you, do one small thing for me right now. Tap that subscribe button, drop a like on this video, and send it to one person who still thinks wars are only fought with soldiers on the ground. It costs you nothing, and it helps this channel keep digging into stories most people never hear the full truth about. Now let's get into it. Somewhere beneath a mountain south of Isfahan, Iran built something most of the world never saw. Not a single bunker, not a hidden warehouse, an entire underground city carved into rock, designed over 4 decades to hide missiles, launchers, and enough firepower to threaten an entire region. Iranian engineers did not build this in a rush. They built it slowly, patiently, generation after generation, each layer added with one goal in mind: make it impossible to find, make it impossible to destroy. For years, that plan worked. Spy satellites could photograph the mountain from above and see nothing but rock and dust. Analysts could study the terrain for months and find no clear sign of what lay underneath. That is the entire purpose of underground weapons infrastructure. It does not need to be invisible forever. It only needs to be invisible long enough to survive a war. But wars have a way of testing every plan a country has ever made, no matter how long it took to build. And in the last 2 years, Iran's underground missile network has been tested more than almost any hardened military site on Earth. To understand why this moment matters, you have to go back to where this entire chapter began in the summer of 2025, when American and Israeli forces launched a coordinated campaign against Iran's nuclear and missile infrastructure. That earlier operation hit sites like Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, directly targeting the places where Iran's nuclear program lived underground. American officials at the time described the damage as severe. Independent assessments were more divided, with some intelligence reports suggesting the setback was real but not permanent. Iran, for its part, insisted its capabilities remained largely intact. That disagreement over how much damage was actually done became the seed of everything that followed. Because if a country believes its enemy only wounded it instead of stopping it, that country does not surrender. It rebuilds. And that is exactly what Iran appears to have done, especially around its ballistic missile program. Isfahan was never just another Iranian city on a map. It sits at the center of Iran's missile production and storage network, one of the most strategically important locations in the entire country's defense structure. Long before this most recent war escalated, Isfahan already carried nuclear significance too, with reports describing convoys quietly moving sensitive material into tunnel systems in the mountains nearby. So when renewed fighting broke out between Israel, the United States, and Iran, it was almost inevitable that Isfahan would become a central battlefield again. What followed was not one strike, it was a campaign. Reports and imagery from this renewed conflict described close to 20 separate bunker-buster strikes hitting the missile complex on Sophie Mountain just south of the city. B-2 stealth bombers, B-52s, fighter jets carrying precision-guided penetrator bombs. Wave after wave of some of the most advanced air power on the planet, all aimed at the same mountain again and again. And here is the part that should stop you cold. Despite all of that firepower, Iran reportedly kept launching missiles from the same general area. Sometimes within hours or days of a strike, local residents described a routine that sounds almost unbelievable. Watching the mountain get bombed at night, seeing the smoke rise, and then watching missiles rise from those same slopes not long after. Think about what that actually means. This was not a case of American and Allied forces missing their target. The strikes were landing, the explosions were real, but the underground network was built with enough redundancy, enough separation between chambers, enough reinforced structure that hitting the surface did not necessarily mean destroying what was buried far below it. That is the entire design philosophy behind Iran's so-called Missile City doctrine. A strategy built on the idea that no single strike, and maybe not even 20 strikes, should be able to take the whole system down at once. This is where the specific weapon involved in the most recent strike becomes so important to understand. Reports point to the use of a 5,000 pounds class bunker buster, a penetrator bomb built for exactly one purpose: punch through solid rock and reinforced concrete, survive that violent journey without breaking apart, and only detonate once it reaches open space on the other side. Earlier reporting on strikes in the same region has sometimes described smaller 2,000 pounds weapons instead. So the exact bomb used in every single strike is not always confirmed, but the target category is not in question. This was an attack aimed squarely at Iran's deepest, most protected missile storage. A weapon like this is typically carried by the F-15E Strike Eagle. An aircraft that offers something bombers like the B-2 cannot always match: speed of response. Because these fighters are often already stationed in the region, a strike package can sometimes be armed and over a target in well under an hour. That matters enormously in a fast-moving war, where waiting for a heavier bomber to fly in from thousands of miles away can mean losing the window entirely. But speed and firepower only solve half the problem. The other half is knowing exactly where to aim. Here is something that rarely gets mentioned when people talk about bunker-busting campaigns like this one. Iran did not just build one entrance into this mountain. Multiple bunker entrances have reportedly been built into the surrounding terrain, deliberately blended into the landscape so that from above they all look roughly the same. Some are believed to lead to real active storage chambers. Others may exist specifically to waste an enemy's most expensive weapons, drawing a strike toward an empty or lightly used space instead of an actual missile stockpile. If that is true, and multiple analysts believe it is part of Iran's defensive strategy, then this entire campaign is not just a story about bombs. It is a story about intelligence, about knowing which door actually leads somewhere and which door is bait. Because a 5,000 pounds penetrator bomb is not cheap and it is not unlimited. Every strike against this mountain is also quietly a strike against America's own stockpile of these specific weapons. Wasting one on a decoy is not just a missed opportunity against Iran. It is a real and measurable loss from a limited supply that takes real time to rebuild. That tension right there, the balance between overwhelming firepower and the risk of being outsmarted by clever engineering, is the real story hiding underneath the headlines. And we are only getting started. If you're starting to see just how layered this conflict actually is, that is exactly why stories like this deserve more attention than they get. Hit that like button if this is opening your eyes even a little, and stick with me, because what happens next in this story might be even harder to believe. So why did this particular strike out of nearly 20 against the same general area suddenly produce something different? Footage that circulated afterward did not show a single fireball and then silence. It showed a mountain that kept exploding minutes after the initial impact had already faded. That detail matters more than almost anything else in this entire story. A single bomb detonation looks a certain way. One flash, one shockwave, then it is over. What witnesses described near Isfahan was something else entirely. Secondary explosions, one after another, as if something buried deep inside the mountain kept catching fire and detonating on its own, long after the original weapon had already done its job. Military analysts have a fairly simple explanation for that pattern. It is what happens when a stockpile of munitions, real ballistic missiles and their fuel, gets exposed to fire and starts cooking off internally, chamber by chamber. In other words, this was not just a mountain getting hit. This was very possibly an actual missile depot getting torn open from the inside, its own stored weapons becoming part of the destruction. If that assessment holds up, it would explain something that has puzzled military watchers for months. How does a target get struck nearly 20 times and still remain operational? The most likely answer is that most of those earlier strikes hit outer layers, entrances, access tunnels, surface infrastructure without ever fully breaking into the deepest storage chambers themselves. Iron's engineers built exactly the kind of separation needed to survive that. Multiple tunnel layers, reinforced blast doors, chambers spread out instead of clustered together, so that even a direct hit on one section would not necessarily set off a chain reaction across the entire base. That is brilliant defensive engineering. It is also, according to some assessments, part of a documented Iranian military doctrine built specifically around surviving exactly this type of war, a strategy sometimes referred to as building missile cities. Dozens of hardened underground sites spread across the country, each one designed with enough internal redundancy that losing one section does not mean losing the whole facility. So when a strike finally does appear to reach deep enough to trigger a sustained secondary explosion, it tells you something important. Whoever planned this particular attack likely had better intelligence than previous attempts. A clearer picture of exactly which tunnel led where and precisely how deep to send the weapon before it detonated. That fuse timing detail deserves a moment of its own because it is easy to overlook, and it changes everything about whether a strike like this actually works. A bunker roster is not judged mainly by the size of its explosion. It is judged by whether it can survive smashing through layer after layer of rock without breaking apart before it reaches its target. The casing has to be strong enough to take the punishment, and the fuse inside has to be engineered to wait, counting the layers it passes through or timing itself precisely. So the detonation happens only once the weapon has reached the actual space it was aimed at. Get that timing wrong in either direction, and the weapon fails at its one job. Detonate too early against the first layer of rock, and you waste the bomb's entire penetrating advantage. Fail to detonate at the right depth, and the bomb can punch straight through a target without doing meaningful damage to whatever is stored inside. The fact that this strike produced sustained internal explosions instead of a single blast suggests the fusing landed almost exactly where engineers intended it to. Now here is where the story becomes even more complicated, because military pressure and political negotiation were happening at almost the exact same time, and the timing between them raises more questions than it answers. Just one day before footage of this strike began circulating, there were public signals suggesting a deal to end the broader war might be close. Then the bunker buster strike happened anyway, hitting one of Iran's most sensitive missile production areas. And within hours of that strike, reports emerged suggesting a follow-up strike package had actually been called off, with word that some kind of agreement had been approved at a high level inside Iran's government and could be signed within days. Iranian officials publicly pushed back on that framing almost immediately, insisting nothing had actually been finalized or signed. That contradiction, a deal reportedly approved at the top, while other voices inside the same government deny any agreement even exists, is not a one-time event in this conflict. It has shown up again and again throughout this entire war, and it points to something bigger than just confusing headlines. It points to a leadership structure inside Iran that appears genuinely fractured, with different factions negotiating, disagreeing, and sometimes acting without full coordination between each other. At the same time this diplomatic drama was unfolding, Iran's military made a very public and very forceful statement of its own. Its navy declared the Strait of Hormuz closed to all vessels once again, warning that any ship attempting passage could become a target. Hours later, 2 Iranian attack drones reportedly moved against a tanker inside the strait. Both drones were intercepted before they reached their target. The tanker completed its journey safely. In the days that followed, hundreds of commercial ships continued moving through protected corridors in the same waterway Iran had just claimed to close. Sit with that gap for a second, because it tells you something important about the real balance of power in this moment. Iran's public statements to its own people described a closed, dangerous strait under its control. The reality on the water told a very different story, one where commercial shipping kept moving largely uninterrupted, protected by active enforcement from opposing naval and air forces. That gap between declared strength and demonstrated reality is not a small detail. It might be the clearest window we have into where Iran actually stands right now. A government fighting to project power, it may not fully be able to back up with action. We are barely past the halfway point of this story, and there is still a lot more worth understanding here, especially what this pattern of strikes actually means for where this war goes next. So, if you're finding real value in this breakdown, do something simple for me. Leave one word in the comments describing how this story makes you feel, whether that is stunned, worried, or something else entirely. I read these, and it genuinely helps this channel understand what stories to dig into next. Let's talk about why missile stockpiles specifically have become such a central target in this war, because there's a strategic logic underneath all of this that goes far beyond just battlefield damage. A country holding tens of thousands of ballistic missiles carries enormous leverage. That stockpile threatens neighboring countries. It threatens shipping lanes running through critical waterways. And in a strange way, it can even function as a kind of insurance policy for a country's broader military ambitions. A deterrent large enough that outside powers think twice before pushing too hard, regardless of what else that country may or may not be building. Strip that stockpile down significantly, and everything shifts at once. Not just the number of missiles a country can physically launch, but its entire negotiating position. Every missile that never gets built because its production facility took a direct hit is a missile that cannot threaten a neighboring country, cannot threaten commercial shipping, and cannot be used as a bargaining chip in future negotiations. That is very likely the real reason missile production and storage sites, rather than just launch pads or communication systems, have become such a consistent focus as this war has dragged on. Destroying stored weapons in the facilities that build them does not just win a single battle. It removes leverage a country would otherwise carry into every negotiation that follows, this one included. Look at how the broader bombing campaign around Isfahan evolved over time, because the sequence itself tells a story. Early phases of the renewed conflict focused heavily on radar systems and communication infrastructure, essentially blinding and silencing Iran's ability to detect incoming threats and coordinate a response. The next phase moved into command and control systems, the connective tissue linking Iran's military leadership to forces out in the field. Only after those systems had been degraded did strikes shift more heavily toward ballistic missile production and storage itself. That progression looks a lot like a deliberate strategy, methodically removing a country's ability to see, communicate, and coordinate before going after the actual weapon stockpile. Whether that sequencing was planned from the very beginning or simply evolved as each phase revealed what Iran had left, the effect ends up being the same either way. Each stage of this campaign made the next stage more effective by stripping away exactly the systems Iran would otherwise use to detect a strike coming, warn its own forces, or recover quickly once the damage was done. There is also a genuinely difficult strategic bet buried inside Iran's response to all of this. Rather than simply absorbing the losses, Iranian engineers have reportedly kept expanding and rebuilding underground storage capacity, even while active bombing continued, essentially betting that new construction could outpace the rate of destruction. That is an extraordinarily hard wager to sustain. Building faster than an opponent with repeatedly demonstrated ability to locate and strike hardened underground targets can tear apart what has already been built. It reflects real defiance. It also reflects something closer to desperation. A government trying to preserve one of its last major sources of leverage, even as the physical infrastructure supporting that leverage keeps getting broken open, strike after strike, month after month. None of this is happening in isolation from the diplomatic track either. This exact pattern, a strike followed almost immediately by reports of a near-finished deal followed by public denial from inside the same government that supposedly approved it, has repeated often enough throughout this conflict that it has become something close to a recognizable rhythm. Maybe that reflects genuine last-minute negotiating breakthroughs that then collide with internal political resistance inside Iran. Maybe it reflects something more calculated, a stalling tactic dressed up as a near agreement to buy time for further rebuilding. From the outside, it is genuinely difficult to know for certain which explanation is closer to the truth. But the practical effect stays the same either way. Ongoing uncertainty about whether military pressure against sites like this one is about to wind down or about to intensify even further, depending almost entirely on decisions being made inside a government that does not appear fully unified on what it actually wants. So where does that leave things right now? Iran appears to want financial support to rebuild what has been destroyed, wants to keep the true size of its remaining missile stockpile out of any written agreement, and wants to preserve as much leverage as possible, heading into whatever final negotiation eventually happens. The opposing side keeps demonstrating strike after strike that even Iran's most deeply buried and most carefully engineered infrastructure is not actually beyond reach, hitting it again whenever the diplomatic track shows signs of stalling. Both sides appear to be negotiating and fighting at the exact same time. An uncomfortable but increasingly familiar pattern in how this particular conflict has played out. There is one more layer worth understanding before we get to how the story actually ends. And it might be the most important one of all because it is not really about bombs or tunnels. It is about what happens to a country's entire sense of security once a core piece of its military deterrent starts visibly cracking under sustained pressure. Ballistic missiles are not just weapons. A country points at its enemies during active fighting. For a country like Iran, that stockpile functions as a form of long-term insurance, a deterrent that makes any outside power think twice before pushing too aggressively. Precisely because Iran has demonstrated both the willingness and the raw numbers needed to make retaliation genuinely costly. Every strike that meaningfully reduces that stockpile or slows down how quickly it can be rebuilt chips away at that deterrent value in a way that compounds over time rather than resetting after each individual attack. A country holding 10 or 15,000 ballistic missiles can absorb the loss of a few hundred in a failed strike and still project real strength to the rest of the world. But the country whose production base keeps taking damage faster than it can realistically rebuild eventually reaches a very different kind of moment, one where every remaining missile becomes far too valuable to risk on anything but the most critical possible target. And whether Iran has actually reached that turning point has not been confirmed publicly. But the sustained pace of strikes against exactly this kind of production infrastructure strongly suggests that American and allied military planners believe pushing Iran toward that point is both achievable and worth the very real cost involved in expending some of the most advanced and expensive precision weapons in the world to get there. This might be the clearest explanation for why a lasting deal remains so difficult to actually finalize, even in moments when both sides appear to signal they are close. Iran's entire negotiating position depends heavily on the leverage its missile stockpile provides both as protection against further strikes and as something valuable enough to eventually trade away in exchange for sanctions relief or reconstruction support. Agreeing to specific, verifiable limits on that stockpile, the kind of concrete limits any credible written agreement would almost certainly require means voluntarily giving up the one piece of leverage that actually worries its opponents the most. That is an extraordinarily difficult decision for any government to make. It becomes even harder for a government as visibly divided internally as Iran currently appears to be, where different factions may hold very different views on whether that trade is even worth making at all. We are almost at the end of the story, and what comes next deserves your full attention because the way this plays out could shape the region for years. Before we get there, if this video has taught you something you did not know 5 minutes ago, that is genuinely the entire reason this channel exists. Share it with someone who still thinks this war is only about nuclear facilities. Because the missile side of this story rarely gets the attention it deserves. Here's where everything comes together. This strike outside Isfahan was not just another entry on a long list of bombing runs against the same general area. It was a rare moment where the underground defenses Iran spent 40 years perfecting appeared to genuinely fail, at least in one specific location, at least for one specific night. A mountain built to hide missiles from the entire world instead lit up from the inside and kept exploding for minutes after the weapon that started it all was already gone. That image alone tells you almost everything you need to know about where this conflict actually stands. Not a war that is close to over, and not a war that is nowhere near resolution either. Something in between, messier, and far more uncertain than either side's public statements would have you believe. A government in Iran that says one thing to its own people and appears to mean something else internally. A military campaign that keeps landing real, measurable blows against targets built specifically to survive them. And a diplomatic track that keeps almost reaching the finish line only to pull back at the very last moment again and again. What happens after this depends on questions nobody outside a small handful of decision makers can answer with any real certainty. Does Iran's leadership actually reach internal agreement on the deal reportedly approved at the top? Or do the fractures inside that same leadership structure scuttle it the way earlier? Frameworks have collapsed before. Does the military pressure campaign against sites like this one continue building towards some kind of breaking point? Or does a genuine ceasefire finally take hold before that point is ever reached? What we do know is this: a mountain that took 4 decades to build layer by layer, specifically to remain hidden and untouchable, was cracked open in a single night. And whatever comes next in this war, that single fact will not be easy for either side to forget. If this story kept you here until the very end, that tells me something worth knowing. Stay subscribed because stories like this one are only going to keep unfolding, and you deserve to understand them clearly without the noise. Thank you for watching all the way through.